Hello and welcome to the first member research presentation for Women in Econ and Policy and the sixth overall session. Women in Econ and Policy is a community that was set up with the aim of creating a free and inclusive space for women interested in econ, policy, and development and to learn and grow together. The motive behind the group is to build each other up by sharing ideas and skills and making econ and policy spaces more accessible. Our member research presentation, starting with Aditi, give members of our group a friendly and open platform to share their work, and we hope to have more of these in the future. So I will quickly introduce Aditi. Aditi is currently a pre-doc at the Development Data Lab. She has a master's in public administration from the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University and a bachelor's degree in economics and government from Cornell. Previously, she's worked as a research associate at JPAL South Asia. And today, she's presenting her work in collaboration with others on Indian judges show no gender or religious in-group bias, a study that measures variation in trial outcomes for defendants of varying gender and religions, and which is conditional on the identity of the judge leveraging a data set of 25 million criminal case records. We will first have her presenting her work, and all of the clarifying questions that come up will be taken simultaneously, and any big questions would be taken at the end of her presentation. For the last 15 minutes, there'll be an open Q&A about building a career in economics research, her experience with the MPA, her RA experience, or any other questions that come up. Please post all questions in the chat, and I think we can get started, Aditi.
All right, I will just share screen quickly. And can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
All right, actually, before getting started, I wanted to start by thanking everyone for taking out an hour out of your Sunday evening to listen to me, chat about judicial bias in the judiciary. And it's actually quite exciting for me because I spot friends from high school in the audience. So this is really an early career researcher's dream. I'm pretty excited about presenting the results from this study, and I must say it's pretty intimidating following up in the seminar series, given the people who have presented before, but I'll try my best to not disappoint. And yeah, before delving in, also thank you so much, Prashansa, Prerna, and the whole Women in Econ and Policy team for creating this platform and this community. It was a resource that I'm realizing now that would have been so helpful when I was an RA at JPAL. And I know what the JPAL RA workload is like. So, I mean, I just keep asking myself, how do you have the time and energy to be, running this on the side? It's really incredible. And you've created this platform for women like me so that, we're able to, this wouldn't have happened otherwise. So serious shout out to you guys. All right, so with that, let's get started and go through the results. I'm getting some feedback, but all right, let's start. Okay, so like Prashansa mentioned, today I'm presenting results from a study that seeks to estimate whether there's any in-group bias displayed by members of the Indian lower judiciary. This is collaborative work with economists across the US and Europe. And we're just beginning the dissemination of our results now. So why is this study important? Why is this research question important at all? So, this paper focuses on bias in the criminal justice system in India, and research on bias in criminal justice systems mostly come from the US. And this research area is rich and mature in the US, but the analogous research coming from developing countries is very little. And there has actually been very limited empirical research on justice systems as a whole in developing countries, let alone bias. So we hope to close that gap somewhat, and we're specifically focusing on bias by religion and gender in the judiciary. A little bit on why religion and gender. I mean, given the current moment in Indian politics, there has been a lot of research, and there have been a lot of op-eds that we have been seeing in the media by Manu Joseph and the likes about the experience of Muslims in India. This is a community that has seen increasing disadvantage in the past decade. And India is home to 195 million Muslims, which is approximately 15% of our population. And their representation in the judiciary is minimal. Here are some stats that I've pulled from the Quint, the India Justice Report from 2019 to make that point. And conversations with anyone who is a professional in the criminal justice system, and if you ask them what are you worried about when it comes to Muslims and the system, they'll probably point you towards the state of under trial prisoners. For those who may not be aware, an under trial prisoner is someone who has been arrested and is waiting for his turn at trial, and may in fact spend entire decades not knowing why they got arrested in the first place. And it is quite unfortunate that 21% of the growing under trial prisoner population in India are Muslim, and this is obviously higher than their population share. So they're overrepresented. So number one, Muslims are overrepresented in the under trial prisoner population. Number two, both Muslims and women are underrepresented in the judiciary given their respective population shares. Just for a little bit of context. Another thing that I want you to keep in mind is, yes, this is a study of bias in the criminal justice system, but there are several stages of the criminal justice system. You can think of it like an onion with layers, sort of. And there could be bias at each of these stages. We kind of read news articles about botched police investigations, whether the police decides to file an FIR, what charge the particular case is even filed under. And then, of course, there's prosecutor assignment, and there could be bias at the prosecutorial level. And finally, after all the investigations are done, you have the judge who is making the ruling. And that's the stage we're looking into bias for. And this is important even from a methodological perspective. So we are only being able to tell you about what's going on for the people who show up in the trial stage. Because we're not seeing all of those people who never made it through these stages. So, I mean, this study is important because it allows you to at least rule out or confirm bias in one of the stages of the criminal justice system. But we should keep in mind which stage of the system we're talking about when we're making our claims. Yeah, this is kind of what I just explained. In terms of the scope of this paper, we're focusing on the lower judiciary. So this is all district courts and courts that lie within the jurisdiction of district courts in India. I should also mention that the study covers all districts of India. So it's the entire universe of the lower judiciary in the country.
God.
Did someone say something?
I think it was just, some unmuted audio.
So, I mean, we are, like I said, we are looking at bias in the judiciary. It may be useful to kind of spend some time thinking about how cases are assigned to judges in the judiciary, because we'll be relying on randomized case assignment in making our claims. So in India, the judiciary condemns the practice of judge shopping, which is where the litigant chooses a judge so that the outcome for them is favorable. And that would be based on their characteristics, based on their networks, and so on. So there is literature and there are decisions of the Supreme Court that kind of really state that behavior such as this should be crushed with a heavy hand. Literally, that was the statement in one of the documents we read when we were researching this. Now, there's an online case management system that is designed to assign unique IDs for random allocation of cases to courts, court of the district judge, court of the session judge, and so on. And lawyers and litigants are informed about the allocation of cases filed by them, and the district judge has the right to override allocation, but this only happens in special cases. So this paper in one slide, what we do is we, leveraging case records of 80 million cases, and we're classifying judge and defendant demographic names by religion and gender. And what we find is that the judge gender bias effects are tiny compared with the kind of bias that has been recorded in the literature in other contexts that are not India. I mean, this kind of research has not been done in India before, definitely not at this level and definitely not quantitatively. Second, interestingly, we find that female judges are consistently less lenient towards all defendants, towards both male and female defendants compared to their male counterparts. And finally, we find no evidence of in-group bias by religion. And because we have a huge sample size, we are able to rule out effect sizes that are 1/5 of those reported by other well-known studies. I mean, yes, it is a null effect, but it is a very, very precise, it's an unprecedentedly precise null effect just by virtue of a sample size. And this is just to stress the point on how our estimate of judicial in-group bias compares with what has been done in the literature before. For instance, you have this paper on small claims courts in Israel that looked at judicial bias by Arab Jewish identity. And this was across 25 courts using roughly 2,000 cases. And this was a paper published in the QJE in 2011. And as you may have noticed, vastly different sample sizes and effects just vary by a huge margin from everything we have seen before. And as you may have also noticed, the contexts are all developed countries, and this is really one of the first papers to do this systematically in a developing country context. All right, so this was the paper in a snapshot, and now we'll be getting into some of the details. So I spent some time describing the data we're leveraging because this is actually one of the valuable contributions of this study. So there's something called the eCourts platform, which was launched by the Indian government in August 2013. And this is like a case management system, partly to help the Indian courts navigate the backlog that is rampant in the system. And so on the system, each case kind of has a unique case number. And there's a PDF such as the one I have shown there that gives you details about the specific case, what act it was filed under, what section, and the various dates of hearing and filing and whatnot. And it gives you the name of the defendant, which is very important. So, and then for judge records, we get it from another part of the same eCourts website. So the scope, as I mentioned already, is all courts that constitute the Indian lower judiciary. We are focusing on all criminal cases filed between 2010 to 2018. So we picked this timeline because this eCourts platform is fairly new. So the further back in time you go, the data gets less complete. And yeah, I've already mentioned what our sample size is. And we also acquired records for more than 100,000 judges pertaining to these same courts. So just a second to digest the data we're talking about. I mean, this was a huge undertaking. So I really want to stress this point that this is what we're working with. And it's a valuable contribution to the literature. So we mentioned that we had 80 million cases, but we then drill it down and we pick out only criminal cases. And then we match the case data to the judge data. And in that process, we come down to 8 million criminal cases. And this is everything else that the analysis is getting drawn from. One big problem that we had is that in the eCourts data, the accused name, I see someone is not on mute. If everyone could put themselves on mute, thank you. All right, so a big issue we had was that in the eCourts data, the defendant, you don't have any demographic details of the defendant other than their name. Similarly, for the judge, you only have their name. I mean, you have salutations in some cases from which you can deduce gender, but like you don't have them for the accused, for instance. So here's where here's where the innovation lies, and we apply a machine classifier. Specifically, we apply a neural network. We train a model to deduce the religion and gender from the names that are there. Quickly about what this long short-term memory neural network is, and how is this, beneficial than say a traditional fuzzy matching. So in a traditional fuzzy string matching program, you'll often have a name, a last name, say Khan, getting matched to Khanna, because the distance between those two names is not that much. But we, those of us who are in the Indian context, know that one is a non-Muslim name and the other is a Muslim name. So the LSTM neural network kind of helps you get around that, because when it looks at characters in kind of a string, it's also thinking about the context in which the character is. So it looks at that fragment Khan, but it also looks at what context it is in. And that's kind of a very distilled description of what we're doing here and what the innovation is here. If anyone has specific questions about the deep learning algorithm we're using, I'm happy to get back to you with more details, since I wasn't the one who worked on this component. I just have a very basic understanding of it. So this is what this involved is training a model based on a sample of names, and then using the trained model on a case and judge data set. This is a sample, this is a training model data. So we looked at the Delhi voter rolls, and we used that data set of names to train the model for gender classification. And then we also acquired a data set with names of candidates who sat for a national railway examination. We used that to train the model for religion. And as you can see, it's a huge data set, and we did an extensive manual kind of verification of our training data set, because our algorithm is as good as its training data, the underlying data that it's trained on. And we, of course, also did verification of random subsamples of the trained data, because analysis is as good as how good, our classification was. And this is just to kind of show you that it's working. On the y-axis, you have in each state what share of the defendants were classified as Muslim by our algorithm. And on the x-axis, you have the underlying Muslim population share in the state, and it broadly aligns as you would expect. So it's picking up something about the real world. Before I start getting into the results, I think I'm going to quickly check whether there are any questions. Prashansa, could you help me out here, because I can't see the chat.
Yeah, there are no questions yet.
Okay, great. So either this is incredibly boring or everyone's absolutely on board.
I think everyone's extremely interested.
Okay, good. No that makes me feel good. All right, so let's look at some of the results. Sorry, I'm just trying to move around this Zoom bar. Can everyone see the full screen of results? Or do you see what I'm seeing? Can you see the full slide?
We see two tables.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Two tables. All right, great. So these are some descriptive stats, and what we're showing here is, so for instance, let's take the top row of panel A, and that's showing you for all the defendants in our data set who are charged with murder, what is the percentage of the murder defendants who are Muslim. And we divide that with the Muslim population share, which is 14.2, to see are they being disproportionately charged for each of those crimes listed in that graph. And as you can see, for a number of crime categories, Muslims are being charged, disproportionately more than their population share. But then when you look at the difference between Muslim and non-Muslim conviction rate, it's not that substantial. So, I mean, we would need a better empirical strategy. This is merely descriptive to figure out whether this is a story of erroneous charges and then things getting corrected at the conviction stage and so on. But this is just to give you a flavor of the data we're working with and what is the Muslim defendant population looking like compared to the non-Muslim defendant population and so on. And these are results we haven't seen before. So we did the same thing for by gender. And as you can see, females for each of those crimes, the percentage of the accused who are female is substantially lower than their population share, which is 48%. Females are 48% of the Indian population. And there's not a, I mean, there's no consistent story in terms of whether females get convicted more often after they've been charged or males get convicted more often. In any case, these are descriptive statistics, and they don't. None of this is causal. I'm yet to show you our results from an empirical strategy which tries to get at causal estimates. All right. So let's get into the empirical strategy of the paper. So, the outcome variable is the trial outcome. What is the final outcome of the case? Now, in an entire data set, 60% of the cases can be assigned as positive or negative outcomes without a premium. But in 40% of the cases, the final disposition name is something like decided or judgment. And it's ambiguous because that could go either way. So to get around this, you've kind of defined the outcome in three different ways. And sorry, I should also mention for these share of cases that have ambiguous outcomes, we went on the eCourts website and tried to look at the actual original PDF of the judge order. In a lot of these cases, the judge order was actually not uploaded by the court. So to kind of get around this ambiguous section of the data, you've defined the outcome variables in three different ways. One of them is whether the defendant got any decision at all. So this variable takes the value of 1 if there was a disposition and 0 if there was nothing. Then conditional on getting a decision, we have an outcome called acquitted. And if the disposition is clearly acquitted, this variable takes the value of 1 and 0 if it is anything else. The reverse of it is not convicted. Conditional on getting a disposition. If the final outcome is convicted, then this variable takes the value of 0 and otherwise it's 1. So across all three definitions, whenever any of these variables have the value 1, it's a good thing. And whenever it's 0, it's a bad thing. So it's consistent for ease of interpretation. All right, so this is an empirical strategy, and I know we have a mixed crowd today, but I'm going to I'll try to go slowly through the difference in difference specifics. So I'll try to go slowly through the specification. So the empirical strategy we're applying is called, standard difference in difference strategy. And what it boils down to is this. So this y that you're seeing in the equation is one of the three outcome variables that I showed on the previous slide. So, and this is the outcome variable, say, for defendant I in court C at time T. And this variable judge female takes the value of 1 if the defendant was randomly assigned to a female judge and 0 otherwise. This variable takes the value 1 if the defendant is female and 0 otherwise. And this is an interaction of whether the defendant was female and whether the assigned judge is female. So this will only take the value 1 when both the defendant and the judge is female. And you have a bunch of fixed effects here that I'll get into. So let's also look into what these estimators are. So alpha is the average outcome for the baseline case, for the reference group case, male judges and male defendants. Beta 1 is the effect of being assigned to a female judge for a male defendant. Beta 1 plus beta 3 is the effect of being assigned to a female judge for a female defendant. Now, to get at bias, you want to see whether a female judge is ruling differently for a female defendant versus the male defendant. So that's just the difference of these two, terms. And that gives you beta 3, which is actually the coefficient on this interaction term. So which is conventionally known as the difference in difference estimate. So if this is positive and statistically significant, we have detected bias, and that bias is causal. It's not just correlational because we are relying on random assignment of judges to cases. All right, these other variables here. So we also included a court interacted with time fixed effect. So what we're doing is in court X, in month Y, we are comparing all the cases that came in. Among all the cases that came in, we are comparing a case that went to a judge of the opposite identity to a case that went to the judge of the same identity. We are also including act and section fixed effects because we want to compare cases of the same offense severity. And we're controlling for other defendant characteristics. The standard errors are clustered at the judge level, since that is the level of randomization. All right, so I mean, since the identification assumption of this study is random assignment of judges to cases, we need to kind of implement a formal test in our sample to see whether this random assignment actually holds. And this table is supposed to convey that to you. So for instance, if female defendants were being assigned more often to female judges, then identification is compromised. And we see that there is no statistical significance on these coefficients, which makes us happy. Similarly, we don't find evidence that Muslim defendants are assigned more often to Muslim judges. And these two panels are just two different cuts of the sample, since we are looking at three different outcome variables. And sorry, I mentioned here that we have cohort interacted with time fixed effects. So we're doing cohort interacted with month and cohort interacted with year. So cohort interacted with month is, like I mentioned, cohort X, month X, all of the cases compared to each other. Cohort interacted year is cohort X, year X. So cohort year has larger sample. All right. What you will notice is that we see some evidence of Muslim defendants being assigned more often to female judges, but this doesn't trouble us for two reasons. A, that is not the characteristic we are testing bias on. B, we are rejecting significant coefficients of substantially smaller sizes than what has been seen in balance tables or other studies in the literature. So this does not worry us for those two reasons. That said, we are controlling for defendant religion in all gender regressions and vice versa. All right, getting into the results. And I'll go through this a little slowly because this is a very important table for us to understand. So going back to, just as a refresher, these are the coefficients that we care about, right? So here, let's take column 1, right? I'm claiming that female judges are less lenient, but they do not rule differently by gender of defendants. So column 1, we find that female judges are 1.5 percentage points less likely to acquit male defendants than male judges. And this is statistically significant. We also find that female judges are 0.4 percentage points less likely to acquit female defendants than male judges. But we don't find that the difference between how they are ruling, so this 0.01 is just the difference between these two coefficients, right? Sorry, we do find that it is statistically significant, but just at the 10% level. And it actually disappears when we're using the quarter of fixed effect. So A, it's a tiny, tiny magnitude. And B, it's not robust to alternate specifications. But what is robust is this finding right here, right? That female judges are less lenient for male defendants than male judges. And there's not a whole lot going on in the outcome variable of having any decision at all. Are there any questions at this stage? I can't see the chat.
There aren't any questions right now on that.
Great. All right, so if this is clear, I'll just move on to the religion analog of this. You see, so this own religion bias row, right? If it wasn't clear, this row is just the coefficient on the interaction term. So in the gender results, this own religion bias row, there's no significance here. There's no consistent story here. But what we do find is some evidence of a defendant being more likely to have a decision at all if they were randomly assigned to a Muslim judge versus a non-Muslim judge. But we don't find any evidence of in-group bias by religion. Again, which is interesting given everything that we have seen in the literature from other contexts. So, I mean, we also hypothesize that maybe in-group bias gets activated when the gender of the victim belongs to, when the identity of the victim belongs to the identity of the judge. So, what we did is we looked at whether there is bias only in cases which were crimes against women. Because in our sample, I mean, crimes against women, the victim is a woman. And in most of these cases, more than 90%, um, the defendant or the accused was male. And our test here would be, do female judges, are they harsher on male defendants than male judges? And I mean, we do see some evidence that, they're less likely to provide a decision, they're less likely to acquit, but it's not statistically significant. And that may be because crimes against women is not a significant share of our sample. So we leave open the possibility that there is something going on here, but we don't pick it up in a strong way, despite a large sample overall, and given the number of cases of crimes against women we have. So this is a big claim, right, that we are making, that we do not detect bias in judge behavior in the Indian lower judiciary context, because this is kind of a digression from what we have been seeing in the literature. And to be really sure about what we're saying, we employed an alternative empirical approach as well. And what we're doing here is we're exploiting judge replacements in courts. A judge replacement is in a particular court, I'm a judge, my tenure gets up, and then I'm replaced by my successor. And what we're looking at is the impact of three different events within a court. So I'll come back to this table after first walking you through an illustration. So here's what is happening. Consider one court. This is the composition of Court A in October 2020. Both males, right? And on October 31st, this guy retires and he's replaced by a female judge. So what's happening? On October 31st, an event takes place whereby the female judge share in Court A increases by 50%. And here is, say, what's on the roster, what's on the docket for judges in Court A, right? You have four defendants, and these two defendants, their cases get decided before the replacement, and their cases get decided after the replacement. And you have a male and a female, a male and a female. So we want to see, is Anjali more likely to get acquitted than Pooja, because her case is getting decided when the female judge share in the court is increased. And we want to see, is Ram less likely to get acquitted than Rahul, because now he is in the court when the male judge share has decreased by 50%. And that's exactly what we're defining here. We have three events. We have pro-defendant transition, where share of judges belonging to the defendant's identity increases by more than 50% in the court. Against defendant transition is the opposite of that. And a composition neutral transition is that, a replacement did not affect the share or the identity share of judges in the court at all. All right. So this is kind of just to show you that what we're doing is working. When we're defining the event that the judge composition is becoming more female, all defendants are indeed more likely to get assigned female judges. Similarly, when we say judge composition is becoming more Muslim, once we've coded that event, we do see that. So each dot here is a case. All defendants are getting assigned to, Muslim judges, more likely to get assigned to Muslim judges after the event. Now, there could be Muslim defendants here and non-Muslim defendants here, Muslim defendants and non-Muslim defendants here, and we are comparing what's going to happen to their trial outcomes as a result of the event. So this is an alternate method to detect bias. This is the formal specification. It's kind of a beast. I won't go into it unless you want to during our discussion. Okay, so here are results. This is illustrative. The full results I'll show you in a table, but this is just because it's a more intuitive way to present it. So the event here is that judge composition is becoming more female, and here all of these dots are female defendants. And judge composition becomes more female, so you would have expected all of these women, if there was bias, to have higher acquittal rates, but you don't really see that. This panel is showing you the same result, but for male defendants. Judge composition becomes more female, and it seems like there's a drop, but it's not statistically significant. If it were, then there wouldn't have been overlap in the confidence intervals. So this is composition neutral judge change. Nothing happened to the female or male shares, and really not a lot happens to the acquittal rates after the transition either. This is the analogous result by religion. This is judge composition becoming more Muslim. On this, I should have mentioned x-axis. So 0, when the x-axis is 0, that's the date of the transition. And on either side is, so each of these dots, like I said, is a defendant, and it reflects the decision date of a defendant. And these numbers are basically distance from the event. So if at all we were picking up something, A, there would have been a jump at the event, and B, maybe there would have been some relationship with how long has it been since the event, and so on. So similar to the previous graph, we really don't see a lot going on here. And what I should point out is here, all I'm showing you is what is the effect of judge composition becoming more Muslim. I haven't shown you the effect of judge composition becoming more non-Muslim because this was just illustrated. Sorry, this is the composition neutral judge transition, nothing going on here. This is the full set of results, right? Pro-defendant transition. So you get a value 1. So each observation is a case. You get a value 1 if your case was decided after a transition that made it more likely that you would get matched to a judge of your identity. Against defendant transition is the opposite. And this is when your case gets decided after a transition that really made no difference for identity shares. And we don't see anything here. This is, I mean, these coefficients would give you a story if they were statistically significant but bias. But we do seem to pick up some signal that around the time of transitions, acquittal rates generally drop. But that's not the story we were investigating in this paper in the first place. So that's full set of results. And I want to come back to this graph that I started. So this paper is big for the following reasons. It tries to fill the gap of doing empirical research on judicial systems in developing countries. The result it finds on in-group bias in such a context is substantially different from what has been seen before. And it's important to note, I mean, the standard errors, you can't see the difference between this coefficient and this coefficient. Standard errors are substantially tiny in our study compared to everything else because, you know, we were able to leverage this equals data set that was out there. And the other thing I wanted to point out is the scope of what we have investigated. We're looking at all crimes and not kind of a cut of a specific kind of crime. And this is an interesting starting point. So this slide is supposed to really communicate to you why this paper matters. It's because A, it has not been done before, and B, what we're finding is substantially different from what we have known in the literature. Okay, so conclusion is that we find a precise and robust zero effect or null estimate of in-group bias along gender and religion dimensions at the judicial outcome stage of the claim process. So we're still not telling you anything about prosecutorial bias, about what's going on in police behavior, because that's not the area of this analysis, but this is still useful because it allows you to affirm or confirm bias at one important stage of the judicial system. We find some evidence of in-group gender bias, but the magnitude is extremely small, as displayed in this graph. And we find no evidence, like a zero, not no evidence. You find a precise zero in terms of in-group bias by religion. So like I said, we are by no means saying that there is no bias in the criminal justice system. We're talking about this specific stage of it in the Indian lower judiciary. I mean, this is a start. There are some open questions that future research can address. One is, does bias exist at each of these earlier stages of the criminal process I outlined? Maybe, we're looking at the preliminary court where the cases enter the system. Maybe you have more bias higher up the judiciary, where there may be more discretion with judges. I'm not the best person since I have no experience in the criminal justice system, or like I'm not a lawyer to kind of comment on that. And future research can also address whether the identity of the victim matters. So that's what I had to share. There's a huge appendix that I will rely on if a relevant question comes up. Thank you.
Great. So we have some questions. I can just ask you, just go through them. So there's one question on the algorithm. If you can address that. So Manjeet is asking, Indian names are quite adaptive and can sometimes find replication across religion and gender. I know male and female, Anaga, Simar, Manjeet, Raj, Simran, and I know Muslim and non-Muslim, Azmat, Zoya, Zubair, etc. My question is, how does the algorithm work with these possibilities, and is that in your standard error?
I think that is a key question, given the identification strategy of the paper. And this is why, especially for gender, what was useful for us is in the judge data set, we had salutations for judges. So we had like a Srimati in front of a female judge named a Thiru or a Tirumati, and we were able to validate what our classifier was doing with these salutations. And we found error rates like less than 12%. It was getting it right in all cases when the name was complete. But if you have like initials, like an MK Aluwalia, then it gets confused because it really doesn't have a name to go by. And I think the question about you do have in a lot of in Punjabi names, for instance, they may not be like decidedly male or female. It's hard for us to tell, but that's where I think that's where the power the that is a hard one. That is a hard one for a human being sitting and trying to do the classification to solve. So there's only so much that the machine classifier can get to. But then, at least for gender, luckily we had the salutation to rely on. But then we did those extensive subsample checks. And another thing I want, so for the judges, we had the salutations that we could validate with and correct in cases where the name wasn't complete and so on. And in the defendant names, interestingly, the name said like Shalu, wife of XYZ, and son of and daughter of. So we could use that to do some validation. Yeah, we could use that to do some validation. But the Muslim classifier is one point, and it is, I know this because I have spent weeks just like with names, like trying to validate it and names floating around and deciding what the correct threshold should be with my colleague. And it works, and this classifier is not the base is the basis not only for this study but also a lot of other work that development data lab is doing, which I should have mentioned is the organization I work with. I can see a few other questions. Should I just
yeah, so basically it's just Kartikeya and Muzna both have similar questions. If there is evident in-group bias, if we run the study specifically for large states like UP or West Bengal, and Muzna is asking, are there heterogeneous results by states with more or less Muslims and thus states that report more or less communal violence? Are you able to check for decisions made just before or after incidences of communal violence in the state district that might trigger judge bias?
Yeah. So I'll take the last question first. So the last one is actually very interesting because one of the studies that I had mentioned, the 2011 QJE paper, looking at small courts claims in Israel, the Arab Jewish bias one, they did a further analysis of looking at whether the bias increases following terrorist incidents. So that is definitely the direction we want to go in. And think of all sorts of ways, the rights after kind of certain political party wins and so on. But we haven't gone into the heterogeneity analysis aspect of it yet, because that will be an entire paper in itself. And that requires much deeper thinking into what we are hypothesizing. One is based on our priors, based on what we know about society. But if you're writing a research paper, you need to have a theory in place about why you expect these things to, like for instance, the bi-state thing. Why do you expect that to happen? Is it because of the share of Muslim, non-Muslim communities in the state? That we need to do, I think, some deeper thinking in making the case for those kind of analyses. Also, because we have to keep in mind that this is research meant for an international audience. So while some of these things, you don't need to translate about why we think this may be the case if it's an Indian audience, but we need to think about what really we're getting at there. But that's exactly the direction we want to go in. So,
Vishaka and Smriti actually have questions that they would like to ask.
Yeah, I think it would be great to break the monotone of my voice.
Okay. Vishaka, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Thanks, Prashansa. Hi, Aditi. Thank you for that insightful presentation. So I had a couple of things to. Is there a difference in judges of different categories belonging to different castes or groups delivering harsher verdicts for the Muslim subgroup? I was also very curious about how this mirrors against how the justice system works in America, where African American populations are more harshly convicted even for petty crimes. I also, while you were answering one of the questions, this came to me. So there's a paper that talks about names. It's done by Senthil Mulaithan, I think, which talks about discrimination, how discrimination works with names, with African American names receiving less. So this was a paper with just resumes posted of neighborhoods and names, and how that showed that discrimination in more African American sounding names. So just wanted to know about this from you. Thanks.
Of course. So I'll take so there was one about how it relates to Sendhil Mullainathan and all's research, one about caste, and what was the third question? If you could quickly remind.
Just a second. I just wanted to know how the group bias measures against what American literature talks about.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So the first one on caste, whether judges of different castes, rule differently. For that, we would have to go further with our machine classifier and also be able to assign caste by looking at the names. But that, as you know, is substantially harder to do because especially when people move to cities, you change your last name because you don't want that to be a recognizable barrier anymore. And we also are kind of constrained in terms of whether there's a universal training data set that we could, model it on. And I mean, that would be incredibly useful, but we haven't cracked that yet. In terms of how it compares to the study you mentioned, I mean, that would require absolutely different intervention, right? Like what we are working on here, there wasn't any intervention or any this is a natural experiment, right? And the way to test that would be, I don't even know how you would do it in this setting because judges don't get to pick and choose that, this is a case, I will not, decide on it. And they actually see the person, but maybe you do one of those studies where you come up with like a case record and you send it to lawyers and whether they decide to take on the case or not. That is one way I could think of that you could measure that, but it's a natural experiment. We just worked with what was out there. I see Akanksha had a question about whether classifier recognizes whether it works with non-Roman scripts. So we actually had to do a lot of pre-processing of the names. So we did a lot of name cleaning work and got the names ready. So that's just the first name and the last name before passing it through the classifier. And as anyone who's been an RA knows, that's the industrial aspect of the work. So.
And Smriti had a question that she wanted to ask. So Smriti, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks, Prashansa. Hi, Aditi. I'm Smriti. I'm actually a final year law student. So a lot of the more economics heavy and empirical strategy related things did go over my head, despite your very fascinating explanation of the same. But first of all, I just want to commend. I thought this was incredible work. I've worked with a far lesser workload of analyzing district court judgments from a particular state, Maharashtra. We were only looking actually at cases under POCSO, which is a legislation that criminalizes child sexual abuse. And we were there tracking how judges respond and their internal biases. And although I walked in, I did that way back, but I walked into that with an idea of perhaps some sort of in-group bias, especially when it came to female judges, because a lot of the defendants are males and the victims or the prosecutrix are females. But I think that does tally up with what you said in terms of there not being such kind of bias. But my question was with regards to just understanding why was it that you chose the district courts? Because I recognize that is a Herculean effort in and of itself, and even navigating within the eCourts website, like you mentioned, was not always convenient, given that it's not always updated. The case management system can be quite troublesome. I think there's a captcha code that you have to put in, and a lot of that comes into play. So I was wondering why it was that that formed the basis of your study. And I think I also spotted in the table that you'd shown us that although the offenses were although you showed that there was no bias, the marriage offenses had a very high overrepresentation amongst the Muslim population. I was wondering why, if you found any reasons as to why that was the case. And in general, I was wondering, so did you look within specific crimes to see, on the overall, I see that it might balance out, but my hunch was that perhaps there might still be some sort of bias within specific crimes?
So, all right, let me go through them in order. Number one, it's incredible that you have that paper. It would be great. I'll reach out to you if you could send me a link, or I can just
Sure,
put it in the-
absolutely. I will.
I think that would be very useful for us to read. Number two, on why district courts. Actually, I wanted to add there, not only are we looking at district courts, but we're also looking at courts that are within the jurisdiction of district courts. So, like subdivisional courts. Of course, metropolitan magistrate courts, I believe, are parallel or like a
Right,
parallel
yeah.
system. So we're looking at everything below the high court, not including the high court. And the reason for that was because of the data availability, honestly. I don't know, I know there's the National Judicial Data Grid, and that has some stuff that also pertains to high courts, but e-courts was honestly the cleanest source that we had. And yes, I agree, it's a huge process trying to get the case level metadata from there, which is why, this study has been going on for more than a year. And a big part of it was just kind of getting the data in order, because half of the time the system would be online in some districts and not online in other districts. So we did it in several rounds so that we could have a complete data set. On your question about the descriptive stats that I had shown of, are Muslims charged disproportionately given their population share by various crime categories? What I wanted to point out is that is a descriptive result. So that's just giving you a picture of what is in the sample. But it's hard to say anything causal there, because you would have to design an empirical strategy to be able to, for instance, there could be so many things, right? Like we don't know what is the underlying crime rate of the Muslims and non-Muslims in India. Like we don't know. Some of the analogous studies in the US have tried to get into that. Like what is the population, like what are the likelihood in the underlying population for XYZ, type of individuals to commit these types of crimes. So, that would take a lot more digging to get into why that is. And that was merely descriptive to, it's important because it's giving you a picture of what is, but that would take more systematic thinking to uncover whether there's any causality to uncover there.
I think Karthikeya's question is still left. Is there evident in-group bias if we run the study specifically for large states like UP or West Bengal?
Yeah, that is also next direction we want to go with it. This was kind of a Herculean effort for getting the data set together and get it in shape so that it is able to, so that one can analyze it. And this is kind of the first, if to think of it as a series of papers on the justice system that have come out of it, this is the first out of it, because we felt like the analysis that was in the slides, enough of a story for one paper, and then we want to systematically dig through some of these follow-up questions. And I sincerely apologize for making so much of that econometrics, but I practiced for this to be like an academic talk, but I'm happy to chat offline on some of the implications. And, if people, especially who are in the law profession, who have insights that, we just out here looking at the data and, using our approaches to analyze. But if you wanted to add color to what we're seeing, that would be great.
Yeah. I think we have all of the questions. I think one question was just, I think you briefly answered this. Is it possible that bias is based on other identity groups such as caste and class?
Yeah, it is entirely possible. And for that, I mean, for caste, like I said, one way to get around it is if you're able to classify the names by caste, and the other way is if we had more detailed information about the judges, they're just like where they got the degrees from, or like where they're from. I don't even know where I'm going with this year. All we had for the judges was the start date and the end date of their tenure, and we had their names and we had the courts definitive. That's all we had.
Yeah, and I think there's one last question, which is super nice work. And are you going to make the data available?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
the short answer is yes. Cool. Okay, yeah, Smriti has a follow-up as well.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, Aditi, just a follow-up on the earlier thing. So I was just wondering, I understand that was a descriptive data set that you provided us there, and a descriptive finding there in terms of what simply was the rate of charging, for instance. But I was wondering if you had looked at the bias within just specific set of crimes as opposed to like the overall picture. Because again, I don't understand the economic, the empirical strategy behind it too much, but would it kind of like balance out if in some crimes it was that there wasn't any bias, but in the others there was, but the proportion of those crimes was far lesser? So would your results still show that there was no in-group bias?
So, okay, so this was to your question. Is this getting towards why we didn't do the empirical analysis by crime category?
Yeah. I was just wondering
Okay.
because I
So,
still
yeah.
had a hunch that there might be something in that.
Yeah. On that quickly. So all we did was the crimes against women. I mean, we were initially also thinking of doing it by property crime, and there are some other ways that you can think of cutting it. But then, I mean, we really have to be sure about what we're doing here. I mean, why should we be interested in looking at murder, for instance? Do we know anything about the underlying likelihood of X kind of individual to commit murder versus Y kind of individual? So, I mean, we didn't get into cutting it too much because we want to like think through why we are doing it. I mean, the data set is huge. We can cut it a million different ways. But the top line finding that on aggregate there's no bias remains.
All right, got it. Thank
but
you.
the crime type thing is interesting because there's a paper recently that came out. It's a job market paper by Carney Wills Sloan that looks at prosecutorial bias by race, and they find evidence of bias only in property crimes. But again, I mean, if we do something like that, and we think about why property crimes, like what is so different about for crimes against women, we had, like I said, we had a clear thought process there that okay, maybe bias gets activated by identity of the victim, but we'd have to think that through.
Understood.
So yeah, there was a crime type called religious offenses in the Indian Penal Code, as you already know. But the number of crimes in the data set that pertain to that section were unfortunately a very small shares. One won't pick up anything. And on whether we're going to make the data available, I just want to point out that the equals data is publicly available. And in fact, it has been used. I want to say the India Justice Report was a collaboration between Bibi and the Tata Group, and they use the equals data to kind of talk about diversity in the judiciary and kind of the state of the judicial system. And then they actually, in talking about diversity, they actually use the salutations available. So that is already out there. But like most of the research that comes out of Development Data Lab, we'll definitely make the analysis and all of that available. I'll get back to you on the specifics of what's going to be out there, to checking with the co-authors. Don't want to say something that's not true, but yeah, just wanted to actually let me reframe that as let me get back to you. My hunch is yes, but let me confirm. On my email, sure.
Yeah. So I think that's it. I think this was super, super nice. Even though we're slightly out of time, I think we can ask the question that we ask everyone, which is what are you currently reading, and like what book would you recommend to like the young people here who are interested?
I am a young person. I'm equally young, if not
Yeah,
more.
that's true. That's true. So I think we can just rephrase it as what are you currently reading?
So I am currently reading. Just read a few pages of India After Gandhi by Ram Guha. I think the issue is, I guess, like most of us, so some of my colleagues from JPAL are out here. I know Mihir and Sohib are out there, and they used to always make fun of me when I was at JPAL Chennai office for just reading work dev and like not keeping track of the real news. So I think in our jobs, we just inject so much of development economics research that you really fatigued about, so in my leisure reading, I try not to read economics books. But a book that I read very recently was Isha Judge Aluwalia's biography, and it's great for any women who are interested in economics and policy to get like a pick-me-up motivation. It's such an easy read, and it's just incredible. So yeah, that's something I do. I To reverse internalize this whole gender economics STEM thing, I just read a lot of like the Cheryl Sandberg kind of books to just get it in my head. So I do that a lot. That's a strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice as well. So I think thanks Aditi for this amazing
Thank you for the
presentation.
opportunity. Yeah.
And thanks to everyone for joining us on a Sunday evening. I think like as things are opening up, people have sort of started facing webinar fatigue, but this was super, super interesting, and thanks a lot, Aditi, and thanks to everyone who joined. For everyone else, like follow us on Twitter and keep in touch with us so that you're aware of all of the events that are happening. And yeah, so I think that's it. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.